Okay, so how many of you read Genesis 38? Yeah, and are you okay? It's one of those stories. And so what is it even doing here? I think that we have, if you've read Genesis 38 already, you have an idea that something more is going on with this section of Genesis than it just being the life story of a guy named Joseph. That there's more going on. This chapter is evidence of that, and the evidence is going to build as we continue through what is normally called the Joseph story. So, yes, I mean, we have Joseph, but it's a little confusing if you already know what's happening in the story of Israel later on, because why would we be following Joseph so closely since he's not even the elect one? The line of the future snake crusher is not going to come through Joseph. So why? There are some scholars who say, well, maybe that's why some Judah story is sort of thrown in here. Other scholars over the centuries have said, this doesn't really belong in the narrative, so they must have just pasted it in later on because they didn't want to leave out some old tradition that they had about Judah, so it just got sort of snuck in between chapters 37 and 39. I disagree, and other scholars disagree with that line of thinking. I think it's here very purposefully and for a reason. I think that there's some deep, deep stuff going on here. So one of the things that happens when we read Genesis 38 is if we come to the Bible with certain lenses, it shakes us. It shakes us. And it is a temptation among modern readers of the Bible to approach the Bible as if there's a story, the reason the story is there is to tell some moral. There's got to be a moral of the story. Read Genesis 38. What's the moral of the story? You have to be very creative to come up with a moral to the story for this chapter by itself. It simply is not doing that. It's doing something else. Also, if you come to the Bible with the lens of, really what the Bible is mostly is you can pick out a verse here and there and put it on, a t-shirt or put it on Instagram, and that's really the purpose of the Bible. You read Genesis 38, and what do you do with that? I don't know anybody that's going to take Genesis 38 verse 9 and put it on a bumper sticker on their car. And if they did, I'd be really worried about them. Coming to Genesis 38 with the lens of it's all theology. And of course, there's lots of theology in the Bible. There's lots of inspirational one-liners in the Bible. There's lots of morals to the story in the Bible. But expecting that out of the Bible as a whole, and that being what the Bible is, it simply isn't. Genesis 38 is an example of that. Same with the theology lens. Is what deep theology am I learning about the soteriological significance of Jesus's incarnation, his substitutionary sacrifice, and resurrection? If you're asking those kinds of questions in that way and coming to Genesis 38, you're going to get a blank stare. And most disturbingly for a lot of people, this is not a story that you can find heroes and villains. Genesis 38. Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? Well, it's not that simple, is it? It's extraordinarily complex, kind of like humans, very complex. So Genesis 38 is doing something different, and that's what we're going to explore tonight. So it takes this really disturbing event from the story of Israel, and the biblical authors take this incredibly disturbing event and use words, phrases, and positioning and structure to place these events in a literary sense, in a way that provokes wisdom as we look at this chapter, but not in isolation. We'll get to that more later. Provoking wisdom, giving us part of the story of why the coming of the snake crusher happens in a certain way. The snake crusher, by the way, I keep using that phrase. For those of you that haven't been with us from the beginning of class, who I'm talking about is the one promised in Genesis chapter 3, the seed of the woman who would someday crush the head of the serpent, and that's Jesus. So this is kind of what the meta-narrative of all of Scripture is about, is leading us to that place where we see, oh, this is the snake crusher that was promised on page 3. Now I see how it all works together. And believe it or not, Genesis 38 is part of this. So let's talk about Judah for a moment. Judah in Hebrew. Judah is not the oldest. He's not the oldest son of Israel or Jacob. He is actually the fourth. He's the fourth. The oldest is Reuben. Reuben has kind of disqualified himself from being the elect one by pulling a power play on his dad, sleeping with one of his father's concubines. Not his own mother, but the mother of some of his brothers. So, yeah, he is obviously taken himself out. Now, Simeon and Levi are the next in line. They're great guys. They slaughter a whole bunch of people because they're related to someone who hurt their sister. That's why they killed them all. So they kind of taken themselves out of the running. And now we've got this guy, Judah. Judah's great character, morally upstanding. Last week we saw how he came up with a plan of trafficking their next to youngest brother into slavery. So we're starting out with this narrative last week with a really bad taste in our mouth regarding Judah. We're thinking of him and saying, I don't know. I think this guy's taken himself out of the running as well. Well, now we have this very disturbing story that serves as a type of hinge, because Judah, who the biblical authors have no compunctions about sharing his flaws, and they are significant flaws. But there's something that happens in this chapter that we begin to see a change. All right, verse 1. And it came about at that time referring to while Joseph is being taken away, somewhere in the time period between Joseph being taken away as a slave to Egypt and when we, have the reunion of the brothers later on, probably close to the time of the last chapter where Joseph is taken as a slave to Egypt. That's the time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite whose name was Hirah, which kind of means buddy, means united or branch or united. And Judah saw there was a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. And he took her, this is the daughter of Shua, as a wife, had relations with her. And she conceived and gave birth to a son, and he named him Great baby name. It's not a great baby name. But I don't see this on the list. This is my child, Then she conceived again, gave birth to a son, and she named him Onan. She gave birth to yet another son, named him Shelah. And it was at Cheziv that she gave birth to him. Okay, in Hebrew means awakened or wake up. Onan means mourn, and Shelah means be quiet. It's interesting. Cheziv, why mention where she gave birth? Cheziv means deception. So we've got a deception story in store. While Joseph is in captivity for 22 years, we've got some relevant instances to discuss. Why is this relevant? We'll talk about that. And here we have a situation where Judah does exactly the wrong thing. In the eyes of the ancient Israelites reading this for the first time, after the Moses team begins to write about this, they're like, no, Judah, the one we know now, later on, is the chosen one from whom the snake crusher will come. He actually marries a Canaanite? That's evil worship people. These are the people that sacrifice their babies to the gods. This is turning bad really, really fast. So what that means to them, to the ancient reader, is Judah has departed from his brothers and he's bound himself to the customs, religious rites, beliefs, so on, of the Canaanites, which is the worst thing you can do. Verse 6. Now Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was Ra in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord took his life. So remember these stories where we have somebody taking something? I think that this is activated in the reader's minds. They say, oh, here's another taking episode. Just as Shechem took Dinah, as Eve took of the fruit. Here, as Sarah and Abraham took Hagar. This is a moment of taking. I wonder if this is right or wrong. Well, it's a little ambiguous at this point. But the Lord killed, mut in Hebrew. He killed. This is the same word that Yahweh uses in Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, when Yahweh tells the human that if he eats of the tree of the knowledge of Tov and Ra, good and bad, he would surely mut, would surely die. So there's a taking and then there's a dying. Same kind of language being used. Was bad. He was Ra, evil, some translations state. I want you to, there's a visual wordplay going on here. I'm not going to do this too much, but I just think this is too cool to pass up. If you look at the Hebrew letters for you see those two letters there? That's the name of this guy. And the word Ra, look at the two letters. It's the same two letters, just reversed. So is Ra. The vowels are not included in ancient Hebrew. So Tamar was taken, but the fruit that was bad was actually So the roles are being switched a little bit here. And he did surely die. Verse 8. Then Judah said to Onan, this is the second son. Okay, have relations with your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her. Raise up a child for your brother. In Moses' time, much later, this was codified into a law in Deuteronomy chapter 25. It's called a law of levirate marriage. The purpose of a levirate marriage was twofold. And what a levirate marriage was, that if a man died before he had children, that his widow would then be given to the next oldest brother or the next closest kin to be married to, so that the first child or the first son of that marriage would then carry on the dead brother's name. So the reasons for that were twofold. Number one, so that the brother who died would be done right by and would have a lineage. But just as importantly, so that the widow would not be an outcast in society in a vulnerable state, but would have a husband and a family and a line to continue of her own. In ancient culture, this was seen as doing right by both the dead son and, just as importantly, doing right by the woman, because she's no longer a virgin. She is no longer marriageable in many cultures' eyes. So you got to step up as the family and provide her with a family. That's what levirate marriage is all about. So apparently, even before this was codified in Deuteronomy 25, this was the custom of people that were, trying to do right by those who are around them, even in Judah's day. So it's showing love to someone who otherwise would be marginalized. If she had a family to go back to, she'd have to go back to that family otherwise, or perhaps sell herself as a prostitute. There just weren't many options for a widow at that time. So Onan, what he's supposed to do is step up and have children with Tamar, and the first of which would be legally his brother Er's child, even though physically it'd be his child. Verse 9, and Onan was not into that. Verse 9, Onan knew that the child would not be his. So when he had relations with his brother's wife, when he had sex with her, he wasted his seed on the ground so that he wouldn't give a child to his brother. So let's just focus on what's happening here. He wants the benefits of the levirate marriage. He wants to have sex with Tamar, but he doesn't want to expend the resources, the time, the energy of raising some child that legally is not even his. It's just giving credit and lineage to his dead brother. He wants nothing to do with that. He wants the benefits, but not the responsibilities. So he has sex with Tamar, but withdraws and casts his seed on the ground. This is not this particular section of Scripture, there are others we could talk about. This particular section of Scripture is not addressing the issue of masturbation. Do you understand that? It's addressing somebody choosing not to do right by his brother, nor do right by Tamar. He's just using her. He's not going to fulfill his levirate responsibilities. And that's why it says in verse 10, but what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord. So he, meaning Yahweh, took his life also. Another thing this is not about is about the modern practice of birth control. It's not addressing that. It's about depriving somebody that ought to have a benefit from you, depriving them, who you see as a rival, of a future, and taking advantage of another person for yourself. Onan, he didn't love God, and he didn't love his brother, and he didn't love Tamar. He is not doing right by them. So this was also Ra to Yahweh. So Yahweh killed him too. Verse 11. So now Judah's lost two sons. Verse 11. Judah said to his daughter-in-law, Tamar, stay a widow in your dad's house until my son Shelah grows up. So you just, go back with your family. My son's too young to marry you and perform his obligation for his brother and for you. But he's thinking, what if he too may die like his brothers? He's thinking, this woman, she keeps killing off my sons. It's like something's going on here. I don't know what it is. All I know is I've got two dead sons and there's this woman who's married to both of them. So go be in a marginalized state and live off of your family if they'll take you. This is the idea here. The ancient reader, this is what they see. So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. So Judah is doing this. He's associating the deaths of his two sons with Tamar, who in the text has done nothing wrong here. His sons have done Ra, according to the biblical authors. The reason that they died is because they've done Ra. Judah is not, he's not on board with that. He simply sees this woman as a risk to his one remaining son and hope of his own lineage. He's looking after himself. Verse 12. Now, after a considerable time, we don't know how long, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, remember this is the Canaanite woman that gave birth to these 3 sons, died. She died. Now, when the time of mourning was ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah. He and his friend Hirah the Adullamite. So he's back with his bud. They're bringing their sheep to be sheared so they can get income off of these sheep. His wife is gone. Time of mourning is ended. Judah, being the person of great character, is thinking of himself and his needs, as we will soon see. So he's on this business trip. Verse 13. And Tamar was told. Now Tamar is living still after a considerable time with her father and her family. Hey, look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So this is what Tamar does. She removed her widow's garments, which she's been wearing all this time, covered herself with a veil. Remember the last time we saw a veil covering somebody's face in Genesis? Leah. Yeah, remember Laban colluded with Leah to cover her face so that Yaakov didn't know who he was sleeping with. Remember that? Can you think of another time that somebody couldn't see properly and gave something to the wrong one? Yeah, Isaac. When his vision was dim, somebody put on a different kind of veil. It was just like goat skin and clothes of his brother, Yaakov himself, to deceive his father. So this is a whole deception theme that's been recurring. And so where did this whole deception theme start? It starts in Genesis chapter 12 with great-grandfather Abraham, who right after he enters the promised land and there's a bit of an issue with food, he goes down to Egypt with his beautiful wife and tells everybody that she's his sister because he's afraid that his life could be at risk. They may want to take her. But if he says she's my sister, well, they might take her, but they're not going to kill him. And sure enough, Pharaoh takes her, doesn't have sex with her, but, that's coming. And all sorts of terrible things happen. So this whole theme of deception, it runs in this family. Okay. So she wrapped herself, sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah had grown up. This is the 3rd son. And she had not been given to him as a wife. And when Judah saw her, he assumed she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face, and that's what prostitutes would do. So here's this masquerade theme that we just talked about. And a veiled woman by the road looks like a prostitute to Judah. That's his assumption. And there are so many ironies that at work to the ancient reader. First of all, Judah, by refusing to provide an available levirate groom to Tamar, he's already assigned her to a life of widowhood, potential prostitution. Because when her father dies, what's she going to do? One of the things that could happen to a widow is they'd be reduced to begging or prostitution. So in a sense, he's created this situation. And since Judah's wife has died, Judah is concerned about the benefits that he would get as a husband sexually, but he's not showing any concerns regarding Tamar's marriage and what she hopes for. So he's leaving her in the dust, right? Forgets all about her, essentially. But he still wants his benefits. So here's this prostitute. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here now, let me have relations with you." What a guy. Oh, to the reader, he didn't know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, well, what'll you give me that you may have relations with me? And he said, "Oh, I'll send you a young goat from the flock." Look, he's bringing sheep to be sheared, but, I'll send you a young goat. And there's no goat there. So she said, "Well, can you give me a pledge until you send it? I need some kind of guarantee that you're going to pay." And he said, "Well, what kind of pledge am I going to give you?" She said, "Your seal, your cord, and your staff that's in your hand." So he gave them to her, and he had relations with her, and she conceived by him. And she got up and departed, removed her veil, put on her widow's garments. Wow. This is in the Bible. So Tamar understands that Judah does not know who she is, and she seizes on this. She drives a really hard bargain. He's on a business trip, so she's conducting business. And for him to give her his seal, think of it like a signet ring, although it was probably, something you stamp. Could have been a ring. Something you stamp into clay to leave an impression. It's like a signature. So his seal, also a cord, which is, different strands of sinew probably, bound together into a rope. It's very strong. And also his staff, which is what he uses to lead sheep and so forth. So you've got his identity in the seal, you have his strength in the cord, and you have his career in the staff. And she's like, "Well, this is how I know you'll come through with payments. You give me all these things." And he just gave them to her. It's like giving your ID and your credit cards. This is what he does. Now, she's not stealing his identity, right? She's not going to get online and, sell a social security number. That's not what this is. Her intention is to reveal Judah's flawed character, and she's using deception to do this. Possibly, because of this, her hope is to gain what Judah owed her, which is what he owed her was the status of being a matriarch in the family. She was not getting. So she goes back to being a good widow after she's conceived by her father-in-law. So you see how there's no good guys or bad guys in this story. I mean, everybody's kind of a bad guy. Is the story trying to say here that if you're going to be the chosen one, you should go out and have sex with a prostitute, and if you accidentally have sex with your daughter-in-law, no biggie? Is the story trying to teach us that? I assure you it's not. Is this story trying to teach us that, hey, if you're not getting what you're owed, the best thing to do is disguise yourself, have sex with your father-in-law? And is the Bible telling us to? No, okay? The Bible's giving us these events and doing something far deeper. And I would submit to you that most of the stories in the Bible are doing something deeper than just the superficial moral of the story. Okay. Shall we continue? Verse 20. So when Judah sent the young goat, remember that's what he owed her, by his friend the Adullamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he didn't find her. And he asked the people of her place, saying, where's the temple prostitute who was by the road at Enaim? But they said, there's been no temple prostitute here. So he returned to Judah and said, I didn't find her. And furthermore, the people of the place said, there's been no temple prostitute here. And Judah said, well, I don't want to hang up signs everywhere. Just let her keep them. Otherwise, we'll become a laughing stock. I think the way this is worded, Judah's not worried about people knowing that he visited a prostitute or who he thought was a temple prostitute, which we'll talk about. He's more concerned that people are going to laugh at him for being taken advantage of and looking stupid. It's his pride. He's like, after all, I sent this young goat. You didn't find her. So the goats in the story of Israel have been connected with deception, haven't they? Remember, this is what Jacob used to deceive his father, to convince him that he was his brother. The skin of which and the game that was cooked by his mother were goats. Remember how goats and sheep, but goats were used to deceive, the goats were deceived by Jacob so that he could gain more property from his uncle. And remember how goat's blood was spilled on Joseph's garments to deceive Jacob, to think that his son was torn apart by wild beasts. Well, now we have a goat in the story again. There's deception that's taken place. But it's for, God's going to do something with this horrible situation. All right. The temple prostitute language in here, I think, is super intentional. Because in Canaanite religion, one of the ways that the temples to Baal or other Canaanite gods would raise money is by sending out prostitutes. The temple was kind of the pimp. And so these prostitutes would raise money, and some of it would go into the temple coffers. It's how one of the ways that these temples and the priesthood and so forth funded themselves. Great fundraising. And so the idea here is that Judah thought that he was funding this Canaanite religion, making a connection narratively with the fact that he married a Canaanite woman. He's bonded himself to Canaanite culture and worship here. It's bad. It's bad. Judah decided not to make any more inquiries, mainly because he was afraid of what people would think of him, because laughing at how he got scammed. So verse 24. Now it was about 3 months later that Judah was informed, your daughter-in-law, Tamar, she's prostituted herself. And look, she's pregnant by prostitution. And Judah, this is not allowed, right? Judah said, well, bring her out and have her burned. Burn her. After all, she's supposed to remain a widow until, if I ever decide that my son Shelah is old enough to get married to, which I'm not ever going to do, she's just going to have to remain a widow. So she's not getting any marital benefits. She's certainly not getting any sex, not allowed. I can, as Judah, of course, if I feel like it. I lost my wife, my spouse, so I want my needs met. She certainly can't have her needs met. Burn her. So for the very same thing that he knows he did, he wants her to be burned to death. It's shocking, isn't it? Do you feel like your hackles rising at this guy? It's like this. This is like one of the worst people you can imagine. Verse 25. It was while she was being brought out that she sent to her father-in-law, saying, you know, I want to let you know who did this. I'm pregnant by the man to whom these things belong. And she also said, this is the word she sent, so please examine and see whose signet ring and cords and staff are these. This is almost copy-paste from the last chapter. Remember when the brothers went to Jacob with Joseph's multicolored or fancy long-sleeved coat and with the goat's blood on it and said, please examine this and see whose is this. Remember that? This is almost word for word, just the stuff is different. This is absolutely connecting with that little deception in the last chapter. Except this is not a deception, this is a revelation. This is what the New Testament authors would call an apocalypse. Apocalypse means unveiling, it doesn't mean end times. So it's like, what? Taking blinders off. So here he is. So now he's got these multiple revelations. First revelation is that the so-called temple prostitute that I had sex with was actually Tamar. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, I am being a total hypocrite by saying she should be burned for the very thing I did. Except she's got more standing in what she did, because the Levirate law later on, or the idea of doing right by a widow in your house, takes precedence over almost everything else. And he chose not to do it. So this is the key moment in Judah's life. It's the next to the most important key moment in Judah's life. Judah recognized them. He's got an apocalypse, he's got a revelation, and said, oh, she is more tzaddik, righteous, than I, since I did not give her to my son, Shelah. And, oh, dear reader, just so you know, he didn't have relations with her again. So this is huge for Judah. What could he have done? He could have done multiple things. He could have just taken, yeah, it was me, but you know what? I'm the man around here and I get to make the decision, and laugh at me if you will, but we're burning her because I'm furious that she pulled this on me, this whole power play thing. I'm the one that does power plays, not some woman in my family. He could have done it. Very possible. He could have also said, she stole this from the prostitute, or she just stole this. I don't know where this came from. What's she talking about? She's trying to cover over her sin of prostitution with someone else. They didn't have DNA testing back then, right? So just burn her anyway. Those would have been the easy ways out. But instead, what he does is he's like, you know what? It's not saying she's righteous, but she's more righteous than I am. In this situation, she's got more standing to being right than I have. It's a self-confession is what this is. He's admitting the fact that he's done her wrong. Now, why did it take this for Judah to admit that he did something terribly wrong? That's a great question. That is a great question. These are humans doing power plays on each other that is deceptive and is oppressive and is horrible and it's traumatic. And this is kind of the human story. I think that the biblical authors are claiming here that rather than interfere with humans doing their terrible things to each other, God has this intention to ultimately just work with these people, not take their freedom to do bad away, but he's going to bring something good ultimately out of this. This whole, the man doing a power play on the woman, here I'm sending you into widowhood for the rest of your life. The woman doing, but desiring the man and having some kind of desiring to be over him in some way. When was this predicted? Page 3 of the Bible. Remember, in part of Yahweh's lament to the couple, this part was not a curse. There were 2 curses, and then there were laments. And one of the laments that Yahweh had in Genesis chapter 3 was, dude, you're going to rule over her, but her desire is going to be over you. Power plays. How do I know that's what that means? Because that's what plays out through the rest of the book of Genesis. That little verse explains what's going on here. And all of these stories explain what was going on in Genesis chapter 3. That's chilling, but it's really cool too for us nerds. Okay, so this is Tamar. This is the unveiling. Here's the credit cards. Here's my ID. So you can either follow through with the execution, or you can, and really look like the fool that you are, or you can do some self-reflection. And he chose self-reflection. He recognizes his sin was worse than Tamar's, and this is an indication that something is different now for the first time in Judah in the story. We see something that up till now we have not seen in him, and that is an admission of wrong. In the view of the biblical authors that are telling us these awful stories that really happened, and this is the claim, in their view, this is crucial to Judah's transformation. Is it the end of Judah's transformation? It is not. It is not. What happens in this story, Genesis 38, is not a self-contained unit. It is connected to something that happens later in a few weeks. In other words, it's chapter 44 is really when Judah's life narrative reaches its climax. I should have worded that differently. What was my point? Okay, I should stick to the notes. Stay with the notes. So there's different reasons for this horrible story going on. One of them being the eventual transformation of Judah, which we're not going to see until chapter 44. But there's lots of other things going on. I'm just going to point out a couple, or one really. In chapter 37, last week, in verses between 22 and 32, we read, please identify whether this is your son's tunic or not, as I pointed out. In 25 and 26 verses of this chapter, please identify who this ring and cords and staff are. So this is a little signal to the reader that these 2 stories are somehow linked. These are linked stories. Joseph's story and Judah's story are kind of running in parallel in some interesting way. We're supposed to see both of these people kind of in a binocular way through the same glasses. We know, having read the rest of the Bible, that Judah is the elect one. Joseph is not the elect one. But who is more innocent so far in this story? Well, Joseph. Joseph has been the one who has been oppressed. He has been trafficked. He has been cast aside as a slave. Judah is the one who's doing He's the one that came up with the idea to sell Joseph into slavery. So let's not kill him. Let's get some cash out of the deal, right? How many of us are here now? Not Joseph. Benjamin's too little. Reuben, I don't know where he is. There's 9 of us. We can split the money 9 ways. This is Judah, right? And here in this chapter, he's the one doing the oppressing. He's the one casting aside Tamar into a state of vulnerability. And yet somehow he's the chosen one. How does that work? And how it works, we see fully in chapter 44. But it begins with, you know what? I messed up. I've done wrong. Even this lady who deceived me and had sex with me so that she could conceive, she's actually more righteous than I am. Where does that put me? You get it? Does that kind of make sense? Okay. All right. And now it's all leading to this. It came about at the time she was giving birth. Behold, there were twins in her womb. And it took place while she was giving birth. So she's got twins in there. That one baby put out a hand. The midwife tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying this one came out first. But it came about as he drew back his hand that behold, his brother came out. And she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. So he was named Perez, or breach. Afterward, his brother came out who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. Oh man, there's so much going on here for future meditation. So briefly, in a sense, we've got a little bit of a replay between what was happening with Jacob and Esau. You remember when they were in the womb? They were wrestling, and one was grabbing the other's heel, and there's just like this wrestling contention thing going on. And the twins kind of get switched because the younger twin actually ended up with the blessing of the birthright. So this birth is described in such a way as to comment on the ambiguous birth order of Israel and Edom, or Jacob and Esau. So it's also a way of commenting on the election of Judah, the role of Joseph, and the future Messiah. How does that all work? Well, it works this way. Notice that the scarlet thread is on the non-chosen, Zerah. The one who is actually the chosen one, Perez, because it's through him that the line of Jesus comes, he does not have the scarlet thread. What are the biblical authors trying to get at here? Just because somebody is non-chosen does not mean that they are not included potentially in God's story and in the grace of God. Chosenness doesn't mean going to heaven. Chosenness means that you're the one through whom the Messiah will come. And in the New Testament, chosenness, and what is chosenness for? It's for being a blessing to everybody else. That's one of the main key functions of chosenness in Genesis chapter 12. So in application to Christians, or to us today, what is chosenness? Who's the chosen one? Jesus. Who's everybody else? Not originally the chosen ones. How are we chosen and known to be chosen before the foundation of the world? Because we're in Jesus, the chosen one. This is what happens, is all through Jesus, all the non-chosen nations of the earth are joined to the chosen stream of Israel in Israel's Messiah. That's what the New Testament authors are telling us about election. They're not trying to tell us about who gets picked out to go to heaven and who gets picked out to go to hell. It's this story that the New Testament authors are talking about. I know it's very hard to reorient our brains to this way of thinking, but I strongly believe that this is what the New Testament writers were catechizing the early Christians about. So the one who appears to be the non-chosen, Perez, he's actually the chosen one. The younger child, who's clothed in priestly and sacrificial colors, scarlet thread, is, I think, referring narratively to Joseph. He's clothed like a priest, wearing that fancy garment, right? He becomes the means for saving his family, which is what the role of a priest is. And so what will the future snake crusher be like? A blend of the two. He'll be in the priestly role, providing salvation for others, but he's also the chosen one, through whom, by being in him, we all become chosen as well. So there's a great quote there for you to read, but we're going to close so we can get ready for Worship Wednesday. So yeah, we made it through Genesis 38. So I don't think we have as traumatic a chapter as this until we get to 1 Samuel 13. But that's long in the future. We don't have a Samuel class planned out right now.